This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. Welcome back to The Common Denominator. I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. I want to open today by reading from a New York Times report from April 6, 2024. I quote, "The New York Times reports from Iranian sources that the entire Iranian army is on full alert, and that the Iranian regime has made a decision that the assassination by Israel of senior Al-Quds Force officials in Damascus requires a direct Iranian response, so as not to damage Iranian deterrence. American analysts estimate that Iran will attack by itself directly against Israel, and not against American targets through emissaries like the Shiite militias in Iraq, for example. An Israeli security source told the New York Times that the security establishment had reached the same conclusion. Iran itself would attack and not act through Hezbollah, its closest ally, which is waging war of varying intensity against Israel along the northern border since October 7th. The estimates now are that Iran will carry out the attack in the coming days and may wait until the end of Ramadan on Tuesday. Obviously, we should not trust this with our eyes closed, and such an attack could be carried out tonight or tomorrow. It seems that the outline of the Iranian attack against Israel will include between dozens and hundreds of drones, alongside some cruise missiles and possibly ballistic missiles. The target of the attack may be strategic military facilities throughout Israel, or even a single facility where the attack will be focused. If this scenario does occur, it will present Israel with a dilemma on how to respond. And this also depends, of course, on the intensity of the attack and its damage, loss of life, the scope of the attack, and the actual damage to the target. Israel has already made it clear to the US that a direct Iranian attack on it, which comes from its territory, will oblige Israel to respond. And here, of course, lies the danger of a rapid escalation into an extensive and powerful regional conflict, in which Hezbollah will also join. Presumably, this is what the head of the military intelligence meant when he said, quote, "complex days are ahead of us." Will the IDF be able to successfully thwart a significant Iranian attack? The answer depends on many variables that are currently not entirely clear. We will have to wait and see, unquote. Now, in addition to that report, we've since passed the 48-hour high alert period issued over the weekend where the CIA warned Israel of Iran's potentially imminent attack. Again, what makes these warnings especially newsworthy is that Iran would itself attack from its own soil and not utilize one of its mercenary proxies sitting in at least 5 countries officially across the Middle East and in many other locations in progress, in which Iran has been sending to terrorize our small country for 45 years, give or take. Israelis, after 6 months of war, one of its longest, under relentless fear, grief, and terror since the October 7th invasion deep into Israel proper, face still the greater and greatest of its enemies, and a signal the real war may still be yet to come. The existential threat wears on our citizens like a rubber band losing its spring. Our spring, perhaps, but not our resolve. Should Iran yet strike, the nature of the attack would determine Israel's necessary response, and thus whether war would continue to unfold to encompass the entire region and perhaps, inevitably, the entire world. Among the many, too many to count, absurd and malicious misrepresentations and misinterpretations of the war in Israel and Gaza is one that underscores all others: the media's unmoving lens on Israel's actions. This singular focus, which would have you believe that it is Israel warring for war's sake, or really, as is implied, for its wicked nature. That media largely ignores the 30,000 strong and well-armed militia that hasn't run out of rockets in 6 months' time. That is Hamas, who commits war crimes as their rudimentary strategy, in civilian clothing and in civilian areas. But what's perhaps notable above even this is the oft-stated afterthought that Hamas and Hezbollah, who assault Israeli citizens from the north, are backed by Iran. We believe, seeing as Iran is the benefactor of so much terror, definitively thriving on chaos and violence, and seeing as they are in fact propped up by the two superpowers of Russia and China, we ought to know more about what drives their genocidal aims. We think we deserve more information than the TikTok historians allow. Theirs promotes a rule or be ruled mentality that has been only and ever suppressed by deterrence. But what will happen to our present Western world who no longer has any taste for war? I share that sentiment more emphatically than words could contain. But at the very moment when authoritarianism is on the rise and terror is emboldened, what can we hope for our civilization looking forward? Long gone are the days of bold statements like, "We do not negotiate with terrorists," and appeasement clearly has not worked in its place. While ours is a Western world, particularly in Europe, that has lost some of its skills to conduct wars, perhaps we have also lost our resolve to confront the bullies of the world, and they can smell the blood in the water. We see this macro chess game reflected in our prior discussions on the micro. The lawlessness that's been unleashed onto the streets of the West is rooted in the indecisive, undeterred, maliciously minded madmen of the East. Here's the thing, though. There is no strategic reason for Iran's aggression with Israel. We share neither border nor resources. We do not argue over water or oil. The single-minded hatred and threat of genocidal destruction is driven purely by the ideology of Iran's present regime. The Islamic Republic of Iran is an Islamic theocracy dominated by Ali Hosseini Khamenei, who has been the supreme ruler in Iran for now 35 years. He's the longest-serving autocrat in the world. Iran's rulership is a Shia Muslim minority in a Sunni Muslim world, and they have a sense of mission. Iran has become infamous, known as the world's largest state sponsor of terror. Iran conducts proxy wars across the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and is actively arming and training groups in at least 6 different locations. Of those 6 militias in training, for one, in the Gaza Strip, where Iran backs the death cults that are Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Hamas, of course, being the ruling leadership in Gaza that invaded Israel on October 7th in the most savage and barbaric desecration of life and death, which has sparked this chokingly foggy war of which we are presently embroiled. In Iraq, Tehran has backed Shiite militants during the US occupation and has maintained those links. The 150,000 strong Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, is a state-sanctioned grouping of heavily armed and battle-hardened Iraqi paramilitaries. The PMF groups have attacked dozens of US bases in Iraq and Syria with rockets, to which Washington has responded with airstrikes. In Syria is a key transit route for Iranian proxies between Iraq and Lebanon. After the Syrian civil war began in 2011, Iran intervened to support President Assad, sending in advisors and fighters from Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Lebanese Hezbollah also fought alongside these groups to preserve Assad and remain stationed now across Syria. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is Tehran's most loyal ally. Formed in the 1980s, they are Iran's crown jewel of terrorism and have been described as the world's most heavily armed non-state actor. Perhaps as much as 200,000 rockets, including large precision rockets, sitting on Israel's northern border with Lebanon and actively lobbing dozens of those missiles at a time at civilian communities and testing the resolve of the Iron Dome. In Yemen, the one Israelis did not have on their bingo card, Yemen's Houthis group seized much of Yemen in 2014 and has fought Saudi-backed dominance of its war-torn Gulf country, where Tehran first backed the Houthis in their fight against its Saudi rival. The Houthis are Ansar Allah, the group's official name. Their motto is, I quote, "God is the greatest, death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews." They are very well armed, including with chemical weapons, and they fire missiles at Israel and at merchant vessels and oil tankers in the Red Sea. The US has struck Houthi targets in Yemen. So then, Iran is the sugar daddy of terror. Why? How? And to what aim? For this one-on-one on Iran, we asked David May of the FDD to join us in discussion. David May is the research manager and a senior research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, specializing in economic warfare. Prior to joining FDD, David was a senior research analyst at AIPAC, where he focused on Israeli-Palestinian issues and the United Nations. David speaks Hebrew and Arabic. He earned a BA in history from the University of Maryland and an MA in international affairs with concentrations in international economics in the Middle East from the School of International Service at American University. FDD is a Washington, D.C. based nonpartisan research institute focused on national security and foreign policy. FDD conducts in-depth research, produces accurate and timely analysis, identifies illicit activities, and provides policy options, all with the aim of strengthening U.S. national security and reducing or eliminating threats posed by adversaries and enemies of the United States and other free nations. David, welcome, and thank you for taking the time today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
So, David, the subject of Iran is one that clearly fills entire careers. And so, yes, I have 24 questions for you, but I also want to give you the lead to explain to us, the Israeli citizens, diaspora Jews, and those who fight democracy and civilization across the world, is what do we need to know and understand about Iran? To that effect, I'll start you off by quoting Colonel Dr. Eran Lehrman, who said, quote, "There's a monument to once upon a time good relations between Iran and Israel, and it's 200 kilometers long and leaks from time to time. It's called the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline and was built to carry Iranian crude oil to the Mediterranean." So why? Why does Iran target Israel? By all reasons, we should be fantastic allies. Really, honestly, David, what's their problem? We really want to know.
So I think you touched on it in the intro, and we should just know that there's a big gap between the regime that is in control in Iran and the Iranian people. The Iranian people themselves, by and large, that it's a very heterogeneous country, so there's a lot of different interests there, but the people themselves are very pro-Western. Many are friendly to Israel, but the regime that's in power is, it's repressive, is regressive, although it sees itself as the spearhead of the Islamic Revolution. They actually refer to themselves as the Islamic Republic, not the Iranian Republic. So their interests are for their version of Islam, not for the Iranian people themselves. But that ideology of revolution is something that it forces Israel to be the center of their aggression, although I should note that the United States is the great Satan and Israel is the little Satan, but we've seen this many times in the past in terms of needing Israel, or when there wasn't an Israel beforehand, the Jews to be a scapegoat for the evils and the ills of one's own society or government. And so Israel becomes a distraction to avoid many of the failures that the Islamic Republic has led its people into. So that's a big part of it. It also, if you're dividing the Middle East, at least the way that the Ayatollahs have seen it, it's a divide between the revolution, those people who are fighting towards this new version of the Middle East, and the regressive Arab regimes represented by the Saudis or Egypt, that were seen as obstacles to progress. And so this revolutionary ideology, it always requires them to be in motion, and that motion happens to be working towards the destruction of Israel.
So we discussed in previous episode the democracy, again, on the macro. And of course, we noted there that actually 49% of the world will be voting this year. So we see that authoritarianism is on the rise in the past 10 years. So it's really is playing out right now what the future will hold, literally quite potentially 2024. And yes, I started to see as well this idea that Saudis are on this side of moderation and modernism, if maybe that's maybe too generous, whereas this sort of dark autocracy seems to be growing. I think that from their point of view, they're doing quite well. Iran thrives. They generally thrive on chaos. They thrive on violence. And the countries that we mentioned, Yemen and Syria and Lebanon, these are all countries that are absolutely chaotic. It's like this radical Islam is devouring these nations whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it quite well. And it's not just a coincidence that many of these places are destabilized. This is actively the work of Iran or the Islamic Republic to destabilize these countries, or some barely countries as it is. You have Lebanon, where following the civil war, every party to that civil war gave up its weapons except for one, and that's Hezbollah. And so when you have one party that maintained its hold on the weapons and every other group, at least officially, gave up their weapons, now you have a huge imbalance. You have basically a failed state with a failing economy. And a lot of it is due to the fact that its patron, Hezbollah's patron, Iran, has put its thumb on the scale in Lebanon. It also is very dangerous because when you have these militia groups in these respective countries that are not accountable to the people of those countries, they're more accountable to Iran. So they have less of a buy-in in terms of how the domestic politics will affect their decisions. And so they do things, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah, things that aren't necessarily beneficial towards those domestic populations, but things that are beneficial to their patron in Tehran. So they're entering destabilized areas, but they're definitely having their own touch on it as well.
So I agree with what you said earlier, which you see again and again, which is that radical Islam seems, from my outside looking in, radical Islam seems to point the blame for its sort of dejected state at everyone but itself, at the Jews, at women, at all of us infidels, but there's zero self-reflection whatsoever. And I think that it's sort of starting from the back, sort of from the end, and bringing it to the beginning of this conversation, really, which is our hope in the Saudis, in a reformed Islam, which hasn't, which we're still, as we can see from October 7th, living pretty much in those dark ages still. Is that where our hope lies?
So I guess I would just step back for a second, just to, as you mentioned in your intro, the divide within the Middle East and within global Islam between Sunni and Shia Islam. Sunni is by far the majority, around 85% of world Islam is Sunni. And then there's the Shia. For the most part, the Shia have been living as a minority wherever they are. Iran is the exception in terms of it being a majority that's in power. You also have Bahrain, where they're a majority, but they're not in power. The ruling monarchy there is Sunni. But so there's the divide between that, and also just a lot of much of the Islamic world does not view Shia Islam at least as legitimate as Sunni Islam. They're different. They have different customs, but also history and religious law and direction. But so Iran, in terms of its current situation, is very much an outlier in terms of history. The history of the Shia being displaced and dispossessed, and maybe if there's an analogy, kind of like Jewish history of the Jews being a minority having to deal with being oppressed. So the Shias have very much that history in terms of where. What the future is. The future is regardless of who the leader is, but it's with different countries that are willing to be pragmatic and view their country's benefit and place that above any irrational hatred that they have towards Israel, the United States. So we've seen that with the Abraham Accords, with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco joining in. It looked for a moment that Sudan was going to be involved, but there is a bit of destabilization there. And they're also, just in terms of the Iran question, very interesting because there's a lot of Iranian influence there. And also they, in the past, have been a base for Hamas as well as Iran. So the future is with pragmatic states that are willing to work with the Israelis. Obviously, touching on what you were saying before, if they are able to be democratic, that's great. But Israel has to work with the countries in its region that it has, not the countries that people want it to have. So that's where we're going for now.
Well, I think that the perspective, it was Haviv Redigor said, it's sort of given me a different perspective. It's that the war is really between Sunni and Shiites, and we are just the battleground that it's happening on. And that, this is my words, but that Israel has to go down first because we are the weakest and the most pathetic. So in order to get that good with God is first we, God forbid, remove that sort of sore that is Israel, and then you can, the little Satan, and then you can address that big Satan. But it's not until you even get through that first sort of marker. Is that accurate? You want to?
Yeah. So I mean, the denominational wars in religions have never been clean. So even between the Protestants and Catholics back in the 14 and 1500s, you had weird alliances that crossed those boundaries, and so you see that as well in the Sunni-Shia divide. I would just say that Israel is the most unifying force in the Middle East in terms of people being able to focus their energies and hatreds on one item. They may not agree on many things, but it's not a weak force. And so we've seen that in terms of Israel standing up and actually imposing, if not deterrence, then just showing their resolve to withstand aggression. But I think it's a very, very accurate point that Israel helps unify both Sunni and Shia on something that where they have a lot of disagreements.
Right. And I think that we see that with Iran's regime, which is Hamas is Sunni. So they're clearly, and I mean, also, and Russia is neither. So they're clearly willing to make whatever allies, whatever gets the job done.
Yeah, so I mean, with Hamas being Sunni, so there's a few different militias and terrorist groups within the Palestinians that have greater or lesser control by Iran. So Hamas, for the longest time, people assumed they were kind of like they're a proxy or they're a vassal. Iran supplies them with weapons and money and directions and instructions, and they mostly adhere to Iranian policy, but they're not at Iran's direct control. I think we've seen that grow a little more in terms of our understanding of how directly controlled Hamas is by Iran, but we also have, it's not just Hamas fighting against Israel, it's the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is really just an extension of Iran. They have zero tie-in to the local Palestinian population. They recruit from them, obviously, but they don't have to have any buy-in from them. And so they're completely externally funded and supplied. And so we saw in, I believe, 2021, when they launched a war against Israel, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad did, and Hamas stood on the sidelines, and Hamas got a lot of flack for not participating. But clearly we saw from October 7th that this was part of a broader Hamas strategy of luring the Israelis into a false sense of security and then coming out with a big strike.
I think that there's sort of different parts, which is that Israel's government, as their methodology, has sort of been to slide by on quiet and pass the buck to the next government and the next government until what we have today is where we're in the red on literally every front. And I think that that's coming home to roost in the most terrifying way right at this moment.
I mean, I would say that's what's potentially happening right now in terms of kicking the can down the road. If Israel doesn't complete the job in Rafah and leaves Hamas in power there, in a few years from now, we're going to be talking about this as another example where the job was not completed. The responsibility was passed down to the next government, the next generation. And it's very easy, especially when you're dealing with the political considerations at the present moment, to decide that completing the job is too costly. But then when you see the ultimate cost of not completing the job, that should also be taken into consideration.
Well, I think that's literally the heart of the matter. And I would like to hear your opinion on that, because that's right now, as of this meeting, we got recent news that all of a sudden, overnight, it seems like even some of our ministers in Knesset might have heard along with the 10 o'clock news with the rest of us, that they pulled out everyone from all of Israeli troops from Gaza, except for one. It's been nothing but talk about going into Rafah. It's absolutely impossible to win this war without going into Rafah. And all of a sudden, where did our troops go? And so we hear different people saying, no, it's just for rest and refreshment, or it's preparations for other wars, whatever it is. It's important to put an emphasis on the need to go into Rafah, which is, as John Spencer or other people have noted, that it's like putting out a fire partially. But the idea is that Hezbollah represents an existential threat to Israel. And the idea is Hamas is the least of Israel's enemies. And to leave Hamas as is will leave them growing to the size and threat of Hezbollah. And so it's absolutely necessary that that job be finished. And we stand right now in this sort of in between, wondering what on earth is going to be, because this stop and start fog of war, I think fog of war would be even unfair. It's absolute that the lack of transparency is demoralizing, would be generous. We're here in Israel. Our lives are what is it, when you make these sort of accounts, whether you run off to the store or whether Iran is going to strike, it's an incredible way to live. But at least being able, but you want to be fighting the good fight with your government, and it would be really a lot easier to do so with a bit more transparency with their citizens. Let's put it that way.
So there's the explanations that you've given. Those are the ones that I've heard in terms of Israel withdrawing most of its troops from Gaza, either for rest and refreshment in order to refocus its strategy against maybe Hezbollah in the north. The other explanations coming out of Washington, or at least with an American focus, are that perhaps the unintentional killing of the aid workers last week was the last straw that broke the camel's back in Washington, which then in turn would take away from Israel its really among its only support internationally, especially when it comes to weapons supply. So those are both explanations. They could maybe exist in unison. I think time will tell which one is accurate. I would just say in terms of Hamas turning into Hezbollah, I don't think that's a concern. I don't think it's ever going to become that serious because the way that Israel has been able to blockade Gaza and control it from most points of entry has prevented Hamas from getting the more advanced weapons that Hezbollah possesses.
Well, that's a real question, David, because 6 months in and they're still firing rockets at us. So it's sort of, we've been wondering on this side, how did that blockage go? How it seems that they've been able to resupply with ease. And quite frankly, this idea of a temporary port is even greater concern for them being able to build up their armory.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that we only know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. And that's always been the danger, the weakness. So we, at least with October 7th, Israel actually knew everything. It just, the way that it evaluated its intelligence just didn't find it to be feasible. But in terms of the weaponry that they have, some of it gets through in terms of the import of dual-use items and other items. They ripped up the water pipes that were there from the Israeli communities that were evacuated, and they turned those water pipes into weapons. If nothing else, maybe the most accurate depiction of Hamas's care for its own people. But I think that Hamas, and also with a lot of Iranian proxies, they've moved more towards domestic production, trying to avoid Israel's capability of interdicting those weapons en route. So they have domestic production capabilities, but definitely in terms of Hamas's ability to fire those weapons, there were points within the war where decent stretches where they weren't able to fire anything. And they get some rockets off here or there, but compared to where they were, it's night and day.
I appreciate that perspective. So that sort of leads us to another subject, which is what we started off with, which is this idea of whether Iran would strike from its own soil. Here's one thought I had heard, which was that they may be unlikely to do so because it's not worth chasing the revenge of a few generals for their nuclear aim, which since Iraq, as Iran doesn't want anything messy, at least from the outside on its own soil, that have put all of their hopes in their missiles and in their nuclear power. And so that's really the aim, and it's full speed ahead. What's your opinion on that?
So you make an excellent point. I'll just refer to the CEO of FDD, who has called Iran's strategy a weapon of mass distraction, a play on words in terms of weapons of mass destruction, which is the nuclear portfolio. So Iran's proxy strategy has been to get everyone focused elsewhere, whether it be Hamas or Hezbollah, but those are, they're minor players in terms of Iran's nuclear weapons capability. If they are able to have a nuclear weapons capability, which they're basically on the brink of having, that's a game changer. You pointed to Iran's ballistic missile enterprise. So Iran, they've invested most of their energy in ballistic missiles and those kinds of less irregular warfare. So they don't have as strong of a standing conventional army, but in terms of their ballistic missile capabilities, it's very, very much up there. They have the most ballistic missiles in the Middle East, and they have their nuclear weapons, their ambitions. So that's what they're aiming for. In terms of their proxy strategy, it's basically, it almost has no harm to Iran itself. They're willing to have Lebanese or Palestinians or Yemeni die on behalf of Iran, and that there's an endless supply of people that they're able to find to fight on their behalf. And they're more than happy to continue to do that and not risk their own assets. In terms of striking from within Iranian territory, I believe that they haven't ever done that against Israel. They did against the United States following the death of Qasem Soleimani, where they struck American troops in Iraq, trying to kill them, but not succeeding. And so Iran they're very hesitant to risk their nuclear capabilities. But on the other hand, their ballistic missiles and their nuclear capabilities have allowed them to engage in so many negative and malign behaviors in the Middle East.
So you think that it's highly unlikely that they would use other than their proxy human shields in this case as well?
I mean, ultimately, Iran, they're, for the most part, even if they have a different set of, a set of facts or set of ideals, they're a rational actor. They just don't operate on the same 4-year time cycle that the Americans do, or if it's Israel, maybe it's the half a year time cycle, depending on elections. But they have a much longer trajectory in terms of their objectives. So they see the gradual. They would obviously be happier if more of their weapons were being directed and not getting intercepted by Israel into Syria and Lebanon. But they have the time and space to continue to do that. They want to encircle Israel in a ring of fire, or whatever other analogy you'd like to have. But they want Israel to be completely surrounded. You still have 100,000 Israelis in the north that for 6 months cannot return to their houses. This is an untenable situation, but it is the situation that we have. And so they have Israel threatened, and they're happy to continue this status quo because they find it advantageous.
Well, let's go ahead. Let's talk about the nuclear deal. Let's talk about what it was. October 2015, this 10-year deal. What was it? Why did we settle for it when, by all accounts, we could have gotten a better deal? Because I'm 26 years in the Middle East and I still can't haggle the best deal. So I appreciate what it is to still be of a Western mindset there. But why did Trump pull out? Where are we now? What we could have, should have, would have done? What can we do from here?
Yeah, so I think it touches on what I was just talking about in terms of the time frame and the trajectory. Iran has a much longer trajectory. They don't have elections for their supreme leader in terms of accountability. But Obama was approaching elections in the United States. He wanted a legacy, to continue to look back upon in terms of containing the Iranian threat, dealing with the Middle East. But there's two different tracks that have to be worked in parallel in terms of preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And that's the diplomatic track, which is what the Obama administration had pursued. But there has to be a credible threat of military action, which for all intents and purposes, the Obama administration gave up on. And we're increasingly seeing the Biden administration forego that as well. So if you don't have the credible threat of military action, and Iran has the advantage in terms of its trajectory and its ability to hold on to power and engaging strategically over decades and not over years, then the nuclear deal that was being negotiated without the threat of military action was never going to be sufficient. And what it left Iran with was basically putting Iran on the brink of having a nuclear weapon and being able to enrich uranium legitimately, granting them legitimacy for Iran being one of the world's greatest oil suppliers and engaging in activities that really have no purpose besides military applications, but somehow legitimizing that process. So, I mean, that's what we've seen. But even beyond that, There's been just especially from the Biden and Obama administrations, a lack of willingness to enforce the sanctions that we had in place already. So that gave a lot of leverage to the Iranians, because we didn't want to risk undermining the the diplomatic talks. And so it's basically a game of chicken, and every time the United States is the one blinking first.
100%. What is so frustrating is that appeasement has never worked. Appeasement has gotten us here today. Appeasement is the reason that Western nations are facing internal upheaval and potential collapse of the West. And what's shocking is that so many brilliant people, so many people on the job, and no one has been able to recognize that this Western ideology does not fit in the Middle East. It just doesn't. With all the will in the world, you can't fit that square peg in this round hole. You just can't. It doesn't work. It's never worked. This has always been a rule or be ruled mentality. It's the shows of power. And the moment, as we see what's happened, the emboldened of Hamas, from every word that comes from the Biden administration, there is no incentive to hand back our dear kidnapped citizens. There is no incentive for stopping rockets or the threats of genocidal attack. This is the thing. Through whatever you want to say, for good or for better, the West, the US, the UK, Europe has taken the role as the world's, I don't want to say policeman, but it's in our interest to see democracies thrive. And the moment that, as we said earlier, that there's no bold action against the bullying, you're only going to get more bullying. I mean, it's an ugly fact. No sane country wants to go to war. Democracies in general, they don't want to go to war. Everybody now, we have half the West who just wants to get on with life, right? They got enough issues at home. It's all gotten mixed up. We want to live our life. This is a conquering ideology, and there's no way around it. And it's just it's the reality. Why aren't we acting accordingly? I don't want to be in this situation. Nobody wants to be in this situation, but we are. So why aren't we acting decisively? What happened? What happened to that resolve?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we're not showing resolve, then we're inviting more attacks. And so when the most recent Iranian general, Zahedi, was killed, the United States, rather than supporting Israel or saying something along the lines of, this is what you get when you engage in all this malign activity within the region, the United States was very quick to deny and say that we had nothing to do with it. And that just does not send the right message when you have, I don't know the exact number, but about 170 attacks from Iranians against U.S. and allied forces. And it only gets met with about 25 U.S. responses when you allow the Houthis, a ragtag militia in Yemen, to shut down one of the world's most important waterways. And rather than engaging in offensive attacks, we're basically trying to defend and play defense. It just sends the wrong message, and also it's just ineffective.
100%. If it's obvious to everyone else, then where's our leadership? I think that most of the good people of the world are asking themselves that question: where's our leadership?
We keep on warning about the risk of escalation. We don't want to escalate. We don't want to escalate. But we're not posing that same question or that same issue to the Iranians, who themselves are very much escalating. So, it can't be a one-way street.
That's right. And obviously not. There's, Kissinger's quote in 2006, right? You need to decide, are you a cause or you're a nation? What did he say? I have it here. Quote, a modern, strong, peaceful Iran could become a pillar of stability and progress in the region. This cannot happen unless Iran's leaders decide whether they are representing a cause or a nation, whether their basic motivation is crusading or international cooperation. The goal of the diplomacy of the six should be to oblige Iran to confront this choice. I think that's Kissinger's Kissinger, but I think that it's clear. Are you a cause or are you a nation? You've got 90 million Iranians in incredible unrest. I think that again, with this last program we did on democracy, they took a poll and there was some 80% of Iranians that were against their autocratic regime and would love a democracy. 80%. In many ways, the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Republic rather, has failed in its socioeconomic policy. They don't believe in the Islamic State. Economically, the country hasn't delivered. They've got social problems. You've got the morality police beating women, to death on the streets. And they're doubling down and they're doubling down. So it's as if really that the attack on Israel, it's saving grace. It can only live for this state of war. That's how it looks from this point of view.
Yeah, no, I think that touches on what we were speaking about earlier in terms of exporting the revolution. Iran has, in order to exist, it needs to grow. If you're a revolution, it needs to grow, and at some point, like a star, it will collapse on itself if it continues to try to grow and doesn't handle the domestic issues. I mean, Israel is a distraction. That's what happened. What we saw with Nasser and Pan-Arabism, that Israel was a distraction. And if you don't have accountability, you don't have a desire to handle and to correct the wrongs that are being done within your own society, nothing will grow. And that's especially what we've seen with the Palestinians in terms of holding grievances against Israel, but having zero accountability for themselves and zero self-reflection. And we also see the international community basically aiding that and enabling Palestinian rejectionism and a refusal to grow. So if the international community wants to do what's best for the Palestinians, it should not continue to enable that mindset of zero agency for the Palestinians. They have to be responsible for their own actions. And unfortunately, in 2006, they voted in Hamas, not just in Gaza, but the majority, a plurality voted for Hamas. And based on the Fatah's terrible electioneering campaign, they basically split the vote amongst themselves and allowed Hamas to win a majority of the seats. And then Hamas did what they did on October 7th and every time before that as well. And so this is what we have. There's accountability for actions.
1,000%. Accountability is the recurring theme. I think that it's the lack of accountability, which I was speaking, of course, with the idea of radical Islam, but it's also what we see across the world, and not even remotely just with the tidal wave of Jew hate. It's this constant pointing this finger at everyone else, where if we cleaned up our own front yards, maybe we'd have better components to come together with. But I think and there was Richard Pearl, a political advisor to several administrations, and he said the dictatorships start wars because they need external enemies to exert internal control over their own people. Right. So you need to create this situation that's chaotic so that you have to tighten the bolt from the inside. And it really does seem that Iran is doing that same playbook. And they need they need Israel to be, their proverbial Satans over there to create.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I would just to, I guess, soften what I said before. Israel's not an innocent victim here. Israel makes mistakes. Israel does things that aren't helpful as well. But if you're the international community, you're trying to make the situation better without bias. You can't continue to enable the Palestinian rejectionism and to ensure that they have zero accountability for their actions. At some point, they have to be weaned off of international support. They have to be self-sufficient. You can't have a situation where generations of Palestinians are considered to be refugees and being told by the international community that they have a right to go to Israel and to claim territory within a sovereign state. It's just this kind of mentality that prevents the Palestinians from having any incentive to end the solution and to come to peace with Israel.
So that idea of that money from the outside in, billions of dollars of Iranian money has been held by the US as part of sanctions against Iran. Right? There was a controversy way back around October 7th about whether the Biden administration was going to release $6 billion of this money right before. So whatever happened to that money, was it actually transferred to Iran in the end? And why is the U.S. sending Iran billions of dollars at all?
Yes, if I'm correct, I believe it was 10 billion, but I might be wrong. But so the Biden administration has been allowing for waivers in terms of Iran being able to access money that's Iranian money that's frozen and to engage in oil transfers with Iraq in order to get money back into Iran. I think that what you're alluding to, this is another situation where making these exceptions, we're allowing Iran these concessions out of fear of Iran pulling out of nuclear talks or destabilizing. And, again, it shows the kind of the one-way street of Americans backing down from Iranian pressure. But at the same time, in the past year, Iran has gone to new levels in terms of nuclear enrichment. So if giving them all this money and not getting the results that we want to see, all it does is it encourages Iran to engage in more malign behavior in the Middle East. And so we've seen that those activities in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and now we've seen the fruit of that with the Gaza war.
Yeah. So Iran is able to fund this terror, despite the US holding their billions or not, through its sales of good old oil and gas, which is largely to Russia. Correct me if I'm wrong, or to China, rather. What is Russia and China's role with Iran, the alliances that they're making? Is it true that Russia really also wants to isolate Iran for their own needs? Because what is the relationship? How are they supporting each other? What's the concern for those connections among many, I'm sure?
So you have three different powers, in different levels of their supremacy. So you have China, which is basically on par with the United States, has surpassed the United States in some regards, and is a big strategic threat to the United States. They also play a long game in terms of wanting to destabilize the United States, to destabilize democracies across the world. They've been doing a lot in terms of disinformation, misinformation. We saw recently the big controversy in terms of TikTok, and them basically trying to, insert all of this anti-Western, and also in the Israeli context, since 90+% of the content on TikTok related to the conflict is anti-Israel. But they're trying to promote this narrative that's anti-Israel, but also they have a national security law within China that allows the Chinese government to seize any information from any Chinese company or company with a footprint in China. So that's dangerous. Then you have Russia, which is bogged down in a war with Ukraine. They still have a very large nuclear arsenal, but in terms of their economic capabilities and their ability to stand against the United States, they're definitely a few steps below China. And then you have Iran, which is probably the most active of the bunch in terms of all of its various activities within the region, in the Middle East in particular. But they're definitely a junior partner in this axis, but maybe the more active. But also all these three countries, they don't necessarily have any affiliations or bonds or unity that are inherent. A lot of it comes in terms of their shared interest in terms of opposing the United States, opposing the West, and to a lesser degree, opposing Israel. Just one other thing I wanted to add in terms of their, not always seeing eye to eye. So I think Syria was a big example of that between Iran and Russia. So Russia had its particular interests in Syria. I mean, they both, Iran and Russia, shared the interest of not letting Assad fall. Assad was the ally and the person in charge in Syria that allowed the Iranians and the Russians to do what they wanted to do. But the Iranians and Russians were doing different things. So the Russians, they had their port on the Mediterranean at the Latakia, and the Iranians, for them, it was the main interest was allowing that corridor between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to have this Shia crescent, or this free travel that they needed, especially in terms of weapons shipments. And so they had different interests. And the Russians, they had a deconfliction arrangement with Israel, allowing Israel to attack Iranian and Syrian and other installations within Syria, as long as they were not harming the Russians. This deconfliction definitely petered out, especially in the past year, with increased tension with Russia. But Russia was definitely, they were showing that they don't necessarily care about Iran's interests when it came to Syria. They were focused more on Russia.
I'm going to go back to the nuclear issue, because that's obviously the primary one. No one in the entire world wants a nuclear Iran. Why aren't we doing more? Who should be doing more? What can we do? And I think before you answer that, what do you think Iran will do? Is it inevitable that they'll get nuclear weapons? And what do you think they'll do with it if and when they do?
So I think a lot of people think that it is inevitable. And if it is inevitable, that you should just get the best deal out of it that you can. It is not necessarily inevitable. We've seen other Middle Eastern powers that were on the brink or that were leaning towards getting nuclear power that were prevented, whether it be Libya, Syria, or Iraq. And so there's definitely actions. But I think Iran has learned from the mistakes of those countries in terms of how to fortify itself, how to prevent its assets from being targeted. And obviously, for Israel, it's an existential threat if Iran is able to get a nuclear weapon, and not just if it uses the nuclear weapon, which is obviously a terrible prospect for a country where most of its population lives within one or two nuclear bomb blasts. But it gives Iran the cover to conduct all the other activities that it's engaging in. So it's definitely a concern, and we've actually seen in terms of negotiations, very often the French have been the most aggressive towards Iran, not the United States. And so maybe we can learn a little bit from them, but it's not something that should be tolerated. And right now, the ballistic missiles that Iran has can target Israel, they can target much of Europe, but they haven't quite been able to reach the United States yet. But they're developing those capabilities, and so the United States should not think that it's immune.
David, is there anything specifically that you think we didn't touch on that you'd like people to know, people to prepare themselves, people to be armed with at least knowledge-wise?
Yeah, so one thing that I forgot to mention, so a big difference between the threat from Hamas and the threat from Hezbollah in terms of Iran's proxy war, it especially comes down to the issue of PGMs, precision guided munitions. And so with Hamas, the thinking is that they maybe have in the handful to dozens of these weapons that basically they're missiles that have guidance. So one big reason why Iron Dome has been so successful against these rockets lobbed against Israeli cities is their unguided nature. And so the Iron Dome is able to calculate their trajectory and fire and strike them down. But if they have precision guided munitions, they'll be more of a threat and more capable of evading Iron Dome. So that's a huge threat. And so Hezbollah has many, many more of these weapons. And so the rocket arsenal of Hamas was estimated between 10 and 15,000. And for Hezbollah, it's 150,000, of which the varying estimates of between 100, several hundred, or 1,000 of these might be PGMs. And so if that is the case, and if a greater conflagration than what we're seeing right now erupts with Hezbollah, the toll on Israeli cities could be very devastating, especially when it comes to infrastructure, the nuclear reactors or power plants in Haifa. And so that's very devastating in terms of their ability. And so one big reason why Israel's been able to prevent those weapons from getting into Hamas is because of the blockade and the other controls they have on the territory. Whereas with Hezbollah and Lebanon, they have these open routes. Israel's been able to interdict a lot of these weapons en route, but some of them have gone through. And also, much like what we see with Hamas, Hezbollah is also using human shields, using these different cities and residential areas in southern Lebanon to embed their weapons and their fighters. And even though we have, at least the paper guarantee from United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, saying that Hezbollah has to stay north of the Litani River, in reality, we see just how useful these UN resolutions and the international community is.
Right, because they don't enforce them, or they selectively enforce them. David, do you think that Israel should deal with Hezbollah sooner rather than later, when they could even have greater capabilities?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the issue of kicking the can down the road. Again, the situation that we have right now with Hamas, it's unquestioned that Hamas launched this war on October 7th. They carried out mass casualty events. They targeted civilians. They killed 1,200 Israelis, most of whom are civilians. And Israel had a good amount of sympathy for a week. And then it evaporated. And, maybe we thought this would be different. It was not different than any other time in the past. If Israel is attacked, they have a small window of sympathy. And then after that, unfortunately, especially with Hamas's tactics, the Palestinian death toll increases. Hamas uses all of its cement to build its tunnels. It hides its fighters under its cities and allows the Palestinians to just be there. They started the war, and now the Palestinian civilians are the ones paying the brunt for the fact that Hamas builds its tunnels and hides its rockets under the cities. Hezbollah does the same, and we won't have the same international support. Israel will not have the same international support to do what it needs to do, and we'll see the same situation of elevated civilian death tolls, which is unfortunate. But that's just the nature of urban warfare, especially with an adversary that has no qualms about using human shields, and also because they're not accountable to their own people. They are accountable to Iran. So that adds another element of their callousness towards the deaths of their respective civilians. So in terms of international support for it, it won't be there. But sometimes Israel has to act in its own best interests and pay the consequences, whatever they may be. There's still there's UN resolutions criticizing Israel for striking the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and they were it was a huge diplomatic incident, and anyone in their sane mind, especially seeing what happened with Saddam Hussein just a few years later, would realize how absurd that is. But that's the nature of the international community, and so it's something that Israel needs to do, but it will pay a huge toll and won't have the support. But one thing that we did see in the days after October 7th, which might play into the calculations of Hamas and Hezbollah, Hamas was hoping perhaps that other proxies of Iran would join into the fray, Hezbollah in particular. But then when the United States sent in 2 different aircraft carriers, that really sent a message in terms of American deterrence. And that was a great message to send. And it possibly prevented a wider conflagration. And that's what we see when America backs up its rhetoric with action. It gets something done. But I don't know if we'll see that same type of support if Israel is seen to be escalating a conflict, even though Hezbollah has been launching rockets since October 8th.
Can Israel face any or all of these threats alone if it needed to?
I mean, the issue that we've seen in the past is Israel's need for resupplies. And so whether it's the Yom Kippur War, or even right now, Israel's expending a lot of weapons and it needs to resupply those weapons. If it doesn't get resupplied, then we'll have to resort to using less accurate weapons, which will then result in more unnecessary and unneeded deaths. Does it have the capability? It probably does, but also what we've seen in the past, when Israel is in danger of not being supplied, then it has to revert or transfer more towards domestic supply. And so there's certain elements of weapons that would make sense for Israel to supply and to produce more domestically. But a lot of this is it's a cost-benefit analysis. And if Israel is spending $50,000 to intercept a $200 rocket, at some point Iran can bleed Israel dry. And so it also comes to comparative advantage, where the United States just has a much larger industry and can produce a lot of these weapons at a better cost. And so defending one's country, it's the ultimate consideration. But if it can be done at a more affordable cost, then it allows Israel to be stronger in many different ways.
How do you see the relationship, with your crystal ball, of course, the relationship between Israel and the U.S., our greatest ally? What do you think's happening with that? What's your analysis of, the alarming, degrading dialogue going on? Do you think it's just for show? Do you think it's a real sign? Where do you think we're heading?
So I think you kind of touched on it right now. There's 2 different tracks that go on. One is the rhetorical track, which is what we see in the media, but then the below that is the professional track. And so even throughout the biggest crises that we've seen in the past few decades in terms of U.S.-Israel relations, The professional relationships are very strong. The meetings go on unhindered, especially with defense coordination. So that's not something that's in danger. The thing that's in danger is, I guess the broader trajectory that's coming from the political side. The United States has elections, and Biden and the Democratic Party is concerned about its left flank. And so that is playing in terms of at least the rhetorical support for Israel. But even just zooming out a little bit beyond the United States, if the United States is alone in its support for Israel, there's limited value that will have. So Israel and the United States, the U.S.-Israel relationship would benefit greatly from other powers, especially Europe, at the very least being friendlier or maybe less hostile to Israel. And so the United States and Israel have to kind of triangulate not only their relationship, but also Israel's broader standing, at least among European powers. We can't, when it comes to the UN, it's a crony, corrupt system where autocrats have, they have control basically of the Human Rights Council. And so the human rights violators are the ones sitting in judgment. But Israel and the United States have to coordinate and prevent Israel's standing from degrading so low. But again, this is a situation where if the United States is leading the pack and showing support for Israel and in ways that might be helpful in terms of setting the tone. And one thing that we saw in particular has been the increased U.S. actions towards Israelis in the West Bank. And so that has basically invited the Europeans to come up with their own actions. They were waiting on the Americans to see what they did. And as soon as the United States is placing actions on Israelis in the West Bank, there's no reason for them not to. That they were basically waiting in the bay for the U.S. And so the U.S. can set the pace on a lot of these things.
It feels pretty dismal to imagine we have to convince Europe to be more pro-Israel. I'm not really sure how we would go about that, not only because of the massive immigration population that has grown, but the sentiment has always been inclined against us, if let's put it like that.
Well, I mean, there's Europe as a whole, but then there's different countries within Europe, and Hungary in particular has been very pro-Israel, especially under its current leadership. But we've also historically the Netherlands has been very supportive, and we've actually seen some significant negative developments in terms of their relationship with Israel since the October War began. And so, obviously it's this big, scary black hole in Europe, but there's different powers. And we also in Germany has been very supportive. And in fact, right now they're being tried at the International Court of Justice for being supportive, that they're being dragged into there for supporting Israel in its defensive war against Hamas.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Germany is being attacked in the ICJ for supporting us for being attacked in the ICJ?
So there's 3 different ICJ cases. One is trying to rule, this was the first one was trying to rule that basically Israel's presence in the West Bank is inherently illegal. And so that was from a UN General Assembly resolution. The second one is the genocide charge that the South Africans have brought against Israel. And the third separate one is brought by Nicaragua against Germany for supplying Israel with weapons, which, according to them, especially building on the South African case, would be basically abetting this supposed genocide. So we're living in this Orwellian situation where Germany's helping Israel defend itself against Hamas is now being construed as supporting ethnic cleansing or genocide or whatever other buzzword you'd have.
It is absolutely incredible. It's just the inversion and the absurdity where again, it's not that words have lost their meaning. They have been actively hijacked and abused. And it's each day it's an exponential growth of that. Every time you think it couldn't possibly, you have the worst atrocity GoPro'd by the perpetrators, right? Modern day Shoah. And we had deniers within as it was probably happening, and it is an exponential growth of that falsehood because people take that those lies, and they just, I don't know, it grows, it's authorized academically and by the media and now by politicians until there's nothing but that noise, is what it looks like, at least from my perspective, that there's no ability to even really question whether so much of this vitriol, where the language itself just implies as an inherent guilt. There's no opportunity for people who, I mean, barring actual curiosity and maybe a Google search, to question whether any of this has any basis in reality. You know, you've got this.
But this is, I mean, it's not a coincidence. This is part of Iran's strategy. Iran helped supply Hamas with the weapons and training that it needed, and it knew that when Hamas carried out these attacks and Israel defended itself, that inevitably many Palestinians would die in the process, and that the world, rather than blaming Iran or blaming Hamas for these casualties, they would lay the blame at Israel's door, even though Israel is obviously doing many things in an unprecedented way to prevent civilian casualties, but this is what happens. So this is part of Iran's strategy of further isolating Israel and the United States, because especially as the United States is seen as Israel's ally, so it takes away from the United States' credibility. And so this is, this is Iran playing into social media strategy, political strategy in a very effective manner.
Incredibly effective. I doff my hat to them, honestly, because you really think that the truth hiding in plain sight would eventually come to surface on some corner of social media. And it has been tremendous success to the point that where we stand here, are we going into Rafah? Are we not? Did we just finish the war with a whimper? Really, was all of this carnage and horror really for this? But it makes me feel, in this not so shiny perspective at the moment, that they won the war, that the war was, like you said, Iranians are far from stupid. They are strategic and they're playing a long game. And this was a crucial battle in that long war, which was the making illegitimate Israel's case, Israel's position. It's as if that was the entire point, as well as, of course, the personal rape of a nation that happened to the Jewish people in their homeland, in their land of their refuge. I would say that the success is astronomical. Everybody's got a phone, 8 billion people on the planet with a phone or two, and that message has accessed everyone. And I guess I would ask you, is it possible? How does one even, certainly this is my attempts here from my corner, but how do we get people back to a sense of truth, to a shared reality? It's incredible to remember that Israel was once not a partisan issue. Israel was a given. Israel's security everyone was fully on board. How do we get back to that place? Can we get back there?
So even beyond that, Israel used to be a progressive issue. People viewed Israel, especially in the wake of the Holocaust, as a correction for many of the errors that the world either committed or allowed to be committed. Israel was this, among some circles, was this socialist ideal, and it had a lot of this promise. But unfortunately, the way that many in the world work, they inherently view power as evil and David versus Goliath. And so that's why many sought to view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict rather than the Arab-Israeli conflict, why they seek to have an Israel-Hamas war rather than seeing it in its broader context of an Iranian proxy war against Israel that's being waged in Gaza by Hamas, but also simultaneously by Hezbollah, and also simultaneously by the Houthis, and maybe a little bit by the PMF in Iraq. And so this idea that the people in power, the people who are stronger, are inherently evil or incorrect, I mean, it's just a completely illogical standpoint. But also, even on its face, it's not even true. When you have the broader proxy war that Iran is fighting against Israel, when you have the fact that they draw from a population of 90 million and then all the other different places versus a small country of 9 to 10 million. So many different ways, it's just false on its face, but also there's no logic to saying that someone who is weaker should then be excused for the atrocities that they committed on October 7th or that they committed before, that they've committed after.
I want to ask you finally, if you were in charge, David, not that you'd want to be, because I wouldn't want to be, what should Israel do and what should the US do, or any other of these Western countries? What should we be doing to move forward? What can we do? What's realistic? And why don't we do it?
So in the wake of October 7th, the emotions in Israel were very raw on a national level. But despite all that, Israel has a professional army, and the professional army is very calculated and very much understands the ramifications of its actions. And when it comes to international support for Israel, I think that there's a lot of people who would want to be more supportive, but they are dealing with the fact of the tragedy befalling the Palestinians. And so they're torn between the real crisis on the ground and Israel's need to take out Hamas. So Israel's leadership could have done a better job from the beginning in terms of preventing that humanitarian crisis from unfolding. But at the same time, by waiting on Rafah, waiting until Ramadan, and then waiting until after Ramadan, they basically slowed the war and allowed for a situation that Hamas might stay in power. So it's kind of twofold. One is that they should have been more aggressive, but also they should have been more aggressive in terms of making sure that the Palestinians on the ground had what they needed. And so those errors in terms of those calculated, and I understand at least at the beginning when the thought was if they could get the hostages back within a few weeks, do put whatever pressure that they can on Hamas to release the hostages. But at the same time, Hamas is not accountable to the Palestinian people. They don't care how many Palestinians die. In fact, the more the better for them. And so the key is just to be able to dislodge Hamas from Gaza, from the Palestinian people, as it is the key is dislodging Iran from the Iranian people and making sure that the fight is with those bad regimes and not with the people that are going to suffer both from Israel, but also from those bad regimes that are hurting their own people.
So how does the world deal with Iran moving forward?
How do they, or how should they?
Both.
I mean, there's a lack of a desire to do anything. There's elections in the US. There's going to be elections in different places in Europe at different points. And so there's always, depending on the year, there's always electioneering and campaigning that's going on. And Iran, again, does not have to do, the Islamic Republic does not have to deal with these limitations. What should be done, there need to be real consequences. And at some point in the past few years, we had a strategy of maximum pressure on Iran. We enforce the same. Sometimes it's not even putting new sanctions in place. It's just enforcing the ones that we already have on the books. Right. We have strategies that can be more tougher against them. If one of its proxies shuts down one of the main international transportation routes for shipping, don't let that stand. And also, if Iran is attacking the United States a dozen times to every response, that's not sending the deterrence. So we're in a situation where you can't avoid escalation that's already existing. Obviously, you have to calculate your responses, but no response has been basically an open invitation.
Clearly. Do you think that the U.S. administration has any hope for heeding such advice?
I mean, obviously, there's very capable people in positions of power, even on the lower levels, and that they know what needs to be done. And I think that they're capable. They're very smart individuals. The question just becomes if we continue to fold every time and just hand the stack to the Iranians.
Well, right now, I think the fear of the world, clearly Israelis first, is that the violence will continue to escalate. Then again, I guess nothing's done until it's done. But obviously that's the fear, is that with one thread, I personally could never have imagined to be sitting in this situation when October 7th was unfolding, that it would lead to this. So certainly we see how quickly things can just snowball into these completely outrageous situations. The bottom line is it really seems that this is the language of military intervention is the one that they speak. And I'm just not sure that we'll be able to find a different language to depressurize this threat to the West.
I mean, we have to attack it through different pillars. And so the threat of military force and maybe even the usage of military force is one of those elements. The diplomatic channels, the economic channels, the cyber warfare, which has been a big element of the fight against Iran. And so all of these have to be exercised in conjunction, and neglecting one or more of those pillars will it will lead to a disjointed policy, and it won't achieve the objectives that we need to achieve.
David, thank you so much for your time and your input. Is there anything that we left out for at least this discussion today?
So, I mean, we had a lot of discussion about escalation, the threat of escalation. And to me, obviously there's real threats of escalation, but to me it seems absurd when Iran, through its proxy, murdered 1,200 Israelis on Israeli soil, when it continues to do everything that it's doing. They've already been engaging in this escalation. And so it's time for consequences for their behavior. And the only way to prevent this behavior in the future is to create a deterrent power. And this requires action diplomatically, politically, economically, and militarily.
I'm with you. I couldn't agree more. David, where can people, with the FDD, is there any place specifically to see your analysis or continue with this discussion?
Yeah, so if you go to fdd.org, that's our website. And if you want to follow our quick takes on X or Twitter, we're at FDD. So you can find analysis from all our scholars. We cover the Middle East, China, Russia, Iran. We cover economic, we can cover sanctions, military force, cyber as well. And so just if you go to fdd.org or find us on X at FDD.
Wonderful. I myself have benefited greatly from the research that you guys have done. So thank you. I can only hope moving forward that we'll be courageous, that we'll be those to come spine straight and show the resolve that Israel, not only that Israel has, because we have nowhere else to go, but that Western civilization is supposed to be the place where people flee to, and that we will remain this vital refuge and or even become, prune down the places that we went wrong in so many areas and become that once again.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, David.